And I want to welcome you all. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mia Burke, and I work as program manager with Hanford Challenge. Hanford Challenge is a nonprofit based in Seattle that advocates for a safe and effective cleanup of the Hanford nuclear site. And the most important thing we do and what makes us unique is our support of workers on the front lines of cleanup. This is the 37th webinar of our Nuclear Waste Scholar Series. If you're new to the series, we started it to inspire action and involvement with Hanford Cleanup by inviting speakers to share groundbreaking scholarship, art, research, and experience working with nuclear waste. And we have almost all of our previous presentations uploaded to our YouTube channel, so be sure to check those out if you're curious. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Myrriah Gomez. Myrriah is an associate professor in the Honors College and the interim director of the Southwest Hispanic Research Institute at the University of New Mexico. She is a board member of Concerned Citizens for Nuclear Safety and previously served on the steering committee for the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium. Myrriah's book, Nuclear Nuevo Mexico, Colonialism and the Effects of the Nuclear Industrial Complex on Nuevo Mexicanos, examines the effects of the Manhattan Project on Hispanic New Mexicans. She is currently co-editing a project focused on U.S.-Mexico nuclear relations. Just as a heads up, if you can't stick around for the whole presentation, feel free to leave. We will be recording the presentation and we'll share a link of the recording with everyone that registered. Thank you so much for joining us today, Myrriah. I will pass it to you to talk about your work.
Thank you, Mia. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to join the series, the Nuclear Waste Scholar Series today. I've been a long-standing fan of this series, and even though I haven't been able to attend, I sometimes watch the recordings, including lovely Umayam, who was here last week. I still haven't gotten to watch hers yet, but I love Lovely, and we actually hosted her on campus at the University of New Mexico just a few months ago. So it's really a pleasure to be here. And today I recognize a few names on the chat and on the participants list, and I'm giving a little bit of a different presentation than I normally give. I'm not exclusively, explicitly talking about the nuclear industrial complex in New Mexico or the effects on Latino communities in general. It's going to be a really pointed conversation on some work that I'm doing now, focusing on Rudolfo Anaya and his obsession with the atomic bomb. So I'm just going to jump right in because I know we are on a clock and I have a lot of information today. So I'm going to start with this map. And the reason I want to start with this map is to sort of geographically situate everyone with New Mexico. When the Oppenheimer film came out a couple of years ago, I was talking with a journalist on the phone and she kept repeating this question, and I kept answering the question, and we were not articulating. And I quickly then realized people don't realize where the Trinity test occurred or where the Trinity site is in relation to Los Alamos. Why is this important? So in 1945, the federal government secret project, the Manhattan Project, which Site Y or Project Y of that project was housed or sited in Los Alamos in northern New Mexico. On July 16th, 1945, they tested the first plutonium bomb in southern New Mexico, known as the Trinity test, and that really issued or ushered in sort of this nuclear age as we know it, right? Before that July 16th, 1945 test, they had actually already conducted over 2 dozen smaller tests of detonation devices that they were testing for the bomb, for the plutonium bomb, in a series called the radioactive lanthanum test that released both radionuclides and heavy metals into the atmosphere since September of 1944. So there was already nuclear testing in New Mexico, but a large-scale bomb had not been tested until that Trinity test. So since 1940, really 1942, because in my work I talk about how this nuclear colonialism really started in the earlier 1940s, which I mark with 1942 when the dispossession of mostly Hispanic, what we would call Hispanic now, or back in the 1940s, they would still readily refer to themselves as Mexicanos de aquí, or what we would call New Mexicans or Nuevo Mexicanos today. People of Spanish speaking, Mexican, Spanish, indigenous descent who lived in New Mexico, who live in New Mexico and in northern New Mexico. That's when they began to be displaced from their homelands in order for the Manhattan Project to start. So we've got about an 84-year history now, 82-year history, I guess, of the nuclear presence in New Mexico. And so to sort of situate how it started, where it started with this map, I also want to point out a couple of things that I usually start with in thinking about why New Mexico continues to be targeted for the nuclear industrial complex and almost every aspect of the nuclear industry, including both uh, weapons development and energy production, even though we don't have a commercial reactor in New Mexico. So, despite the fact that we get more federal funding in New Mexico for the two national laboratories and the related industries, we are still, it's more money than our state operating budget. We are still consistently ranked among the three poorest states in the country, including in a study that just came out about 2 weeks ago. We continue to have a limited job market, although I'm very interested in thinking and talking about the economy created by the national laboratories. Like I just mentioned, we have a huge dependency on federal dollars, and New Mexico contains two of the nation's three nuclear weapons laboratories, including the Los Alamos National Laboratory, which is in Los Alamos, and the Sandia National Laboratories, which is here in Albuquerque, where I'm speaking from today. And regardless, those figures are kind of daunting, and it really is this sort of deficit model. And that is not at all what I want to present, especially in my talk today. In thinking about sort of an asset map of New Mexico, here's some landscapes. And I realized this morning when I was reviewing my slides, I'm like, I don't have people in here, and people are a huge part of this. But I pulled some beautiful images off my cell phone, including a chili garden. This is my dad's chile at my home where I grew up. The second one is a traditional acequia. And this image was taken in Taos, New Mexico. The acequias are what feeds our agricultural system in northern New Mexico. We're still very much a land-based people. The third image is from taken from the vantage point of White Rock, right near Los Alamos. It's a bedroom community for Los Alamos, and that's a view of the Rio Grande, the Rio Grande River. And then the fourth image I just took very recently, that is an image headed north, so to my east are the Jemez Mountains, and I included that image because today I'm going to be talking a lot about the Jemez Mountains. And so in thinking about the assets that we have, it's the culture, it's the land, it's the people, and it's the combination of all of these things that put the nuclear industrial complex in this scenario with the people and the cultures of New Mexico. So, not to go too much into this, I think a lot of you who are here today are probably already familiar with the nuclear industry in New Mexico. I like this cartoon. I always use this cartoon that was published in the Albuquerque Journal on Easter Sunday 2017, created by John Trevor, which at the time showed sort of New Mexico as the nuclear option, definite play on, this congressional nuclear option as well. But it shows sort of and this is out of date now, right? But it shows the what has often been called the cradle to grave nuclear industrial complex in New Mexico, including the Manhattan Project, including all of the uranium mining and milling and conversion that's happened here, the nuclear waste storage that we have here in nuclear weapon storage here in Albuquerque. It's stored at the underground munitions at the Kirtland Air Force Base, where over 25 nuclear weapons without plutonium pits are stored. The testing, that's the Trinity test. That is, this low-level waste storage dot is actually not entirely accurate. That's transuranic waste. That's the WIP site. Uranium enrichment, which is Urenco, spent uranium processing, which we actually don't have, that never came to fruition. The United States doesn't have, as we know, with the Hanford project, right? There's no spent uranium processing or any sort of reprocessing with that, with waste either. And then the temporary high level waste storage was the the proposed site for Holtec that was pulled off the table last summer of 2025, and then the high level waste deep borehole research project that never came to fruition. So, in thinking about, and there's some parts missing on there that I'll talk about throughout my presentation today, but in thinking about this existence of nuclear colonialism, a lot of people have wanted to put us in sort of this post colonial state, but we're not. And so instead of thinking about this and one of the reasons I'll just add that we're not is because as some of you might have heard last March when Chris Wright visited Los Alamos and he made this big declaration that AI is the new Manhattan Project. Um, AI is really ushering in with these data centers and this discussion in small modular reactors. And now that the EPA has rolled back all of these restrictions for reactors, we're going to see AI really become a huge nuclear issue in this country. It's already happening, right? Including, specifically the creation of nuclear waste and the fact that we have no solution for that. So, with all of these things happening, one of the ways that I've chosen to think about it now is using this framework of nuclear coloniality, which, drawing from Nelson Maldonado Torres, refers to the coloniality refers to long-standing patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism, but that define culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administrations. And this is where I am sort of focused in my research, all of the different research projects that I have going right now. I'm really looking at how this nuclear industrial complex has defined and affected culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production. And I really feel that Anaya's work, and I'll introduce him in a second, um, is a is a really interesting window to be able to examine that nuclear coloniality. So what has happened as a result of this 82-year history is that the that nuclear weapons production has been normalized, particularly in New Mexico, right? But I think across the nation, and we're really seeing the building of conversations, daily conversations. We're seeing it more and more in the media because of what's happening between the U.S. and Iran, including Israel and Pakistan. Um, Russia and China are always in the background, but we're hearing about this on a daily basis now. And so, in thinking about this normalization of nuclear weapons, there are 7 areas that I'm really focused on: the aesthetic, the socioeconomic, the psychological, the physiological, political, spiritual, and ethical realities. And as I delve into Anaya's work, and you'll see some of this today, you see all 7 of these things come up constantly and consistently. And I'm going to focus on a few of his works, but as I'll demonstrate, it appears in so much of his work and it hasn't really been tracked. And that's part of my bigger project, is tracking how vastly he was writing about it and what that obsession was. And the argument that I'm trying to make is that he is making the argument that nuclear weapons have become so normalized in New Mexico that they are now part of our culture. And so, what does that mean when nuclear weapons have embedded themselves into culture so that they are seen on the same level as spiritual and religious practices, so that they are seen on the same level as socioeconomic necessities, right? You often hear people in New Mexico say, if the lab were to close, we would lose the entire economy of northern New Mexico, for example. And I've never argued against that, right? One thing that I always try to say, though, is I've never said shut down the labs, but we need to stop producing nuclear weapons. So you see this normalization of nuclear weapons and this theme emerge throughout Anaya's work because of this nuclear colonial, or maybe in spite of this nuclear coloniality. So I don't want to assume that everybody knows who Rudolfo Anaya is, or was, just because I am so obsessed with him. I love when people ask me, because I teach in an honors college, an interdisciplinary honors college. People often ask, well, what sorts of courses do you teach? And next semester I am teaching 2 classes. One is called The Legacy of Nuclear Waste, and the other one is my Rudolfo Anaya class. And so it's sort of hard to see, difficult for some people to see the connection between a lot of these things. And today I'm going to try to make that explicitly clear, although it doesn't always have to be a direct connection. So I'll be discussing who Rudolfo Anaya was, What does he have to do with nuclear weapons, and why does this matter? This image right here is a painting that was done by Paloma Pasnava that was exhibited in an exhibition focused or dedicated to Anaya's works called Ultima, that was at the National Hispanic Cultural Center, curated by Agustin Romero several years ago. And this image, those of you who are familiar with my book, so Paloma painted the cover image of my book, and people always ask me about that cover image. So originally, can you see my cursor? So originally, we were going to publish this section of the painting as the cover. And the setting here is the llano, the plains, the setting for Bless Me Ultima. And this is Ultima, and I'll talk about this novel in a second, and Antonio and the Golden Carp. And then when I talked to Paloma, because we needed to get her permission, she said, I'll paint you a new one. Tell me what background. And it came out lovely, but it's a very different rendition. So this was the original. And interestingly enough, it is a direct reference to Anaya's work, right? So Rudolfo Anaya was born in 1937 outside of Santa Rosa, New Mexico, and he died in the year 2020. His family moved to Albuquerque when he was very young, and so you see a lot of themes in his work, positioning the rural against the urban in New Mexico, and how both the rural and the urban developed over the course of at least his lifetime. He's really best known for his 1972 novel Bless Me Ultima. Some people regard this as the first Chicano novel with a capital N. Definitely, there were other people, other Chicanos or Mexican Americans who were writing before him, which he is always identifying. I've come to realize in his work, he has given credit where credit is due, but he is really the one that put Chicano literature on the map. And this novel he began writing in 1967. He received many rejections for it, and today it's one of the most frequently banned books across schools and academic curriculums. He's the author of 13 novels, 10 children's books, eight published, oh, that should say plays, sorry, eight published plays, and countless poems, essays, and short stories. So to say he was a prolific writer is an understatement. These numbers are actually very significant because part of the purpose of this project that I'm working on is to show how often, how frequently atomic themes show up in his writing. And so when you have a body of work this large, and it shows up as frequently as possible, as frequently as it does, it means that it was definitely a major theme across his lifetime, including 1967 when he started writing, which I'll get to in a second. Two of the biggest awards that he received that I want to make note of are the National Medal of Arts Lifetime Honor Award, which he received in 2001, and the National Humanities Medal in 2015 that was presented to him by President Obama. We have in our library here at the University of New Mexico, there is a sala that is dedicated, a room that is dedicated to him. And there's lots of ephemera there, including a photograph and the medal that was awarded to him. And he was already in a wheelchair. You know, this was about 5 years before he died, but it's a lovely photo of President Obama bestowing that medal on him. And so the title that he typically is known by is the Padrino, or the Godfather of Chicano literature. I don't have a number here. His book has been republished in I don't even know how many languages. Earlier this week, I was attempting to read the Japanese translation of Bless Me Ultima, which is a really beautiful book. So when I say that he's been writing about this since the beginning of his published career, the very first mention of the atomic bomb in his work and in Chicanx literature, to my knowledge, appears in Bless Me Ultima in chapter 17. And I just want to read this quote. The spring dust storms of the Llano continued, and I heard many grown-ups blame the harsh winter and the sandstorms of spring on the new bomb that had been made to end the war. The atomic bomb, they whispered, a ball of white heat beyond the imagination, beyond hell. And they pointed south beyond the green valley of El Puerto. Man was not made to know so much, the old ladies cried in hushed, hoarse voices. They compete with God, they disturb the seasons, they seek to know more than God himself. In the end, that knowledge they seek will destroy us all and bend back. and bent backs, they pulled back shawls around their humped shoulders and walked into howling winds. And so I wanted to read the quote before I explained the book, the novel a little bit. So the novel is what most of us would consider a Bildungsroman. It's a coming of age story of a young boy named Antonio Mares, and he is stuck in this sort of perpetual fight of good against evil, trying to weigh that as a boy who's probably about third grade age in the novel. There's a curandera, a local healer, a traditional healer who is his family moves back home, moves into their home, and some of the townspeople call her a witch or think of her as a witch. And so he's trying to negotiate who she is throughout this, and she becomes his mentor, teaching him to work with the land and teaching him lots of spirituality. And so this scene is really significant. El Puerto de Luna is the community that they're in. It's a small community. And this is one of the communities of Anaya's mother, I believe. It's a very small community near Santa Rosa. And this reference, they pointed south beyond the Green Valley. Santa Rosa is actually not that far from, as the crow flies, from the Trinity test, from the Trinity site. So they would have been pointing that way. The novel is set in the 1940s, right after the war. There are characters who return from World War II with PTSD, and it becomes sort of a major issue in the novel. And so he grounds that. He starts off literally with his writing career, uh, placing the atomic bomb right at the center of New Mexico society and New Mexico culture. And from there, it sort of takes off throughout his work. I want to really point to the series that he wrote toward the end of his writing career. Well, maybe not toward the end, but it's a tetralogy, so a series of 4 books. The first book, Zia Summer, was published in 1995, followed by Rio Grande Fall in 1996, Shaman Winter in 1999, and then Hemis Spring in 2005. Today I'm going to be discussing mostly Hemis Spring, but I want to point out that Zia Summer and Rio Grande Fall also have a nuclear bomb, or it's actually not always a bomb, a nuclear plot as the central plot. Shaman Winter, it's in the background, but all 4 of these books really engage, and 3 of them center nuclear culture in New Mexico. Um, I want to pull a little bit just to also make the point that I'm not the first author or first scholar who has sort of noticed that Anaya is writing about nuclear issues, right? In a really, really great book, Brown Gumshoes, Detective Fiction and the Search for Chicana or Identity, Ralph E. Rodriguez writes, throughout the Sanibaca series, this is the 4 that I just talked about, Anaya demonstrates his awareness of pressing social concerns in New Mexico, such as homelessness, unemployment, nuclear poisoning, and the drug trade, but these concerns become no more than indices of the larger battle between good and evil, which Baca fights on spiritual rather than material grounds. Moreover, Baca's spiritual battle casts him in an awkward role of the Chicano everyman, an untenable position in a world of proliferating and protean identity formations. So, a couple of things about this quote. First of all, Rodriguez wrote Brown Gumshoes before Hemis Spring came out, so he was only writing about the 3 books. Just keep that in mind. But the way he positions nuclear poisoning as a pressing social concern for Anaya and also part of the identity formation of the main character, Sunny Baca, is really significant because it shows that nuclear issues are influencing the way we think about identity formation of every New Mexican here, right? Another quote where he says, as articulated in the series, the governance of the Nuevo Mexicana depends not on the laws of state, but on a struggle between good and evil that is connected to rescuing the ways of the ancestors. In other words, the success of the social contract and the longevity of the Nuevo Mexicana population hinge on understanding the history, mythology, and folkways of those whom Anaya identifies as the señores y señoras de la luz, the lords and ladies of the light. And so what I'm really fascinated by and sort of fixated on in this moment is my claim, or this idea of what Rodriguez is saying about how he's rescuing the ways of the ancestors, which means that either the ways have been lost or the ways are at risk of being lost. In other words, our culture is at risk, right? And so I'm trying to draw this connection between, again, referencing that coloniality and that normalization of atomic weapons. Um, if we are losing our ways and our culture, and nuclear weapons, nuclear poisoning is a central part of our concerns in New Mexico now, then it's a question really, that a hypothesis that I guess I'm testing, can nuclear weapons in the nuclear industrial complex be blamed or be held responsible for why we are losing our ways in our culture? And that's ultimately the question here. So Anaya's work is one of the first places where we see in writing the nuclear industrial complex being blamed, and he is blaming, that's my claim, for loss of Nuevo Mexicano culture. The plot of nuclear weapons and the battle between good and evil in at least 3 of the 4 books in the series prompted my questions regarding how Anaya viewed the significance of the atomic bomb and the nuclear industrial complex in New Mexico. But the detective series isn't the only place he writes about it. It's actually everywhere in his writing. So before I read this last question, I was drawn to this several years ago because of this series. This is where I noticed it and I started writing about it. It was a paper I wrote early on in my academic career. And then as I finally got to the point where I wanted to explore it, I realized it was in more places than I realized. So my question is, what commentary is he making on the nuclear industrial complex? There's another really great article by Daniel Arvino, which in this article he writes, a recurring theme in Anaya's works is that the development of the atomic bomb was a betrayal of God because humans took this gift and harnessed it for violence. Moreover, this notion of manipulation that humans will call it peace, reflects anxiety about the lies and secrecy that allowed the nuclear labs to operate in New Mexico and call their purpose security and defense. So when I'm talking about Anaya or talking about the effect on cultural production, the effect on culture that the nuclear industry has had, part of the question is that we can't really explore this as in a strictly academic sense, right? I'm not thinking about these things as like literary analysis strictly. Really, it's thinking about what is the function of the nuclear labs in New Mexico today, in terms of thinking about the purpose, their supposed purposes of security and defense, right? So when we have these, I guess another way to say that is, why is literature important? Why is cultural production important? Because it's reflecting what's actually happening and the real issues that we should be concerned with. The plots in the novel are fiction, right? It's fiction, but where's the fact in that fiction? It's trying to pull apart the fabulations from the fiction. And whether or not Anaya is fabulating these fictional accounts, he's drawing on important facts in order to do that. And so I want to alert the audience, for those of you who don't know, to the increased pit production that's happening in New Mexico right now for the development of not just the current nuclear arsenal, but it's actually helping to develop pits for new nuclear weapons, the W87-1 warhead. Part of this increase in pit production, or the majority, I guess, stems from the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, which was published at the beginning of the first Trump administration. And in the introduction of that NPR, the line reads, the United States remains committed to its efforts in support of the ultimate global elimination of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. And as I like to say, dot, 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 and to do that, we are going to produce no fewer than 80 pits per year. So this is what it says later on in the document, right? So the United States will pursue initiatives to ensure the necessary capability, capacity, and responsiveness of the nuclear weapons infrastructure and the needed skills of the workforce, including 80 pits per year by 2030. So what ends up happening, some of you might know this, is 2 sites get tasked with creating these plutonium pits. Los Alamos National Laboratory becomes responsible for creating a minimum of 30 pits per year. And Savannah River Site in South Carolina is supposedly responsible for 50. Well, that was 2018. We're in 2026. Savannah River Site is still not operational, which means all the pit production currently happening for the nuclear arsenal in our country is occurring in Los Alamos. Just a few weeks ago, there was a headline in our local newspaper, and it was on the news too, stating that the protections, the level of milirentigen exposure was being upped from 1 to 5 at the labs. And obviously, this is in due part, thinking about the needed skills of the workforce. This is due in part to the increase. When we say increase, it means faster work, more people working on it, just basically lowering protections for workers and the standards. And so this is what is happening when in starting in the 1990s, really, or early 2000s, I guess, Los Alamos became pretty much the only site producing plutonium pits, but never were we producing 30 per year at Los Alamos. And plutonium pits become the center of the plot in Hemis Spring. So remember, Anaya writes this in the year 2021. I'm sorry, 2001, which is about the time that Los Alamos became the pretty much sole facility producing pits for this country. And, who would have thought 25 years later this would be happening? And plutonium pits are the core or the triggers of nuclear weapons. I sometimes tell middle school students it's the part that makes the bomb go boom. So when we think about the 2,500 plus nuclear missiles that are being stored underground in Albuquerque today, those weapons actually don't have plutonium pits in them. It's a storage facility, but they are not loaded, so to speak. So thinking about, or I guess the connection I want to make now is how plutonium pits became Anaya's sort of obsession, maybe. That might be too strong of a word at this point. But what gave him the impetus for using that as the plot of his novel Hemis Spring? This is a different map that focuses strictly on that northwest corner or area of New Mexico around Los Alamos. So here you have Los Alamos, which is where the Los Alamos National Laboratory is within there. Earlier, I mentioned White Rock, sort of a bedroom community where that photo of the Rio Grande was taken. You have Valles Caldera National Preserve. So yes, Los Alamos National Lab exists on a fault line where there's still volcanic activity. But then there's this sort of other side of the Hemis Mountains, this Hemis Springs area, which is different than Hemis Pueblo, which is different than the community of San Isidro. But this whole area here along Highway 4 before Highway 4 turns and then heads south to Albuquerque. You eventually hit Albuquerque when you go south of Bernalillo. This is where that novel takes place. So it takes place between Hemis Pueblo, Hemis Springs, Los Alamos, and White Rock mostly. And what is the plot? Okay, so here's a couple of quotes just to give you a sense of it. The plot is that there's a bomb hidden in the Hemis. The governor's dead and somebody planted a bomb up on the mountain. It's a weird contraption, but the lab boys from Los Alamos say it's radioactive. The shit has hit the fan, Sonny. So this is, I believe it's the state police chief that's talking to Sonny Baca. Sonny Baca is the protagonist in this novel. He is the great grandson of the late Elfego Baca. If that name does not ring a bell to you, Elfego Baca was this famous Wild West sheriff. Disney actually did a film about him in the 1950s, I believe it was. And so Anaya's always drawing on these really sort of significant historical figures and events and trying to connect them to his current plots. But Sonny is a private investigator. And so he often works with the police and the local authorities to try to figure out these mysteries that the regular authorities can never solve. Because this is the fourth book in the series, you actually don't need to have read the first three books. It's good if you have, because then you understand that there is a long-standing sort of I can't even think of an English word, bronca. There's a an issue with between Sunny and the antagonist, the bad guy whose name is Raven. And uh just to read the second quote, a bomb, and the feds knew Raven was in possession of a plutonium pit, but he had lain low during the past 3 months and now he was out of hiding. So in Rio Grande Fall, Raven steals a plutonium pit from Los Alamos. And now, at the very beginning of this novel, page 11, we see that Sunny is after Raven again because everybody believes that Raven has put the plutonium pit in this bomb, and now they've put it on top of uh, up in the on the mountain. Um, yes. Okay. So let's keep going. So Sunny Baka versus Raven. I'm not so much interested. I am a little bit interested in Sunny's character, but I'm also really interested in the way that Anaya positions Raven. Raven is sort of this, there's strong connections between him and indigenous cultures, but he is not indigenous. He is just sort of this very dark, terrorist sort of character. He's described as an anti-nuclear terrorist, which I think is equally important in thinking about like what Anaya was doing with nuclear issues, because he's the bad guy, but he's also pro anti-nukes. Does that make sense? He's like anti-nukes. And so I haven't quite figured out what Anaya was doing there. But you see a lot of desensitization, that normalization that I'm talking about with the bomb here. There's another quote toward the end of the novel. They end up canceling work for the day because, like, everybody is in danger. The world is in danger of ending here. And Sunny is making his way through Albuquerque. Everybody's home. There's cell phone service has stopped. Internet service has stopped. It's just craziness. And instead, you see all the people partying in the streets. And it says, Viva la bomba, someone shouted, and a loud hurrah went up from a nearby table of revelers. They were cheering the bomb? Yeah, cheering the cause of their release from work, the cause of their merriment. Only in Alburquerque, Sunny thought, as the cheer went up again. Viva la bomba! Sunny had to smile. Was this the way to face the inevitability of possible death by nuclear fire? Not with a whimper, but a fiesta? Why not? So it could be here that, yeah, if we're gonna die, we're gonna party it out. But I think there's something else happening here, which is that people have become desensitized. And part of this is because of that secrecy and obscurity that I help use to define nuclear colonialism, which is that when people are working there and they're going up to work every day, they become desensitized to the work that they're actually doing. Or if they're doing something that's at a computer, they're doing maybe admin work, they don't even realize on a daily basis that the work that they're doing or contributing to is to make nuclear weapons. And so it's this commentary, I think, on the normalization or desensitization of what's happening. And then this other one, you think this is Raven talking. You think me a common terrorist, is that it? Maybe I will blow up the Hemis just to teach you a lesson. Destroy the Los Alamos labs, blow it up and have your government blame Al Qaeda, blame Osama bin Laden, blame anyone. It's much easier to blame the immigrants, the commies, terrorists, but the real enemy is within. It's the beginning of the end. And one thing that fascinates me about this quote, so remember 2001, he was writing this right after September 11th. And what what was the real enemy is within, it's a call to question about whether Anaya is actually taking to task the people who are working at the labs, building the weapons, never considering themselves the enemies. I'm not really sure what to do with this at this point, but I think that is the commentary, right? And the last quote I'll use from here, and I'm paying attention to time, is thinking about what Anaya is saying about potential nuclear war in New Mexico. Is this a question about it started here, we'll end it here? He writes, isn't it appropriate that the last world war started here with Los Alamos, in the mountain where the first atomic bomb was developed, in the state where the Trinity where at Trinity site it was exploded? And so the question here is, why would Anaya write about nuclear war destroying New Mexico? So I want to leave that question hanging a little bit and talk about another short story that he writes about, which is called Devil Deer. This is an image, it comes from this reader, but I love this title, this image, this story is published in multiple places, but the painting here, the cover art, is the image of Devil Deer. So Devil Deer is set in between the Los Alamos National Laboratory and a local Tewa Pueblo, probably either San Ildefonso or Santa Clara. And essentially what happens is that the Pueblo men have stopped hunting the ridge above their community because the lab has fenced off part of the ridge that now glows yellow at night. So he writes, nobody hunted near the fence. The ridge lay silent and ominous on the side of the mountain. On the other side of the ridge lay Los Alamos, the laboratories, and nobody knew what the hell went on there. But whatever it was seeping into the earth, seeping into the animals of the forest. To live within the fence was deadly, and now there were holes in the fence. So the story goes that this man named Cruz prepares to go hunt the ridge by himself. And the night before his hunt, he has this dream, and this bear appears to him in this dream and tells him to go away and not hunt in this place. Well, Cruz ignores the dream. He goes the next day. He kills a deer, and as he's tracking the deer and he comes upon the deer, it is just the most gory, sort of gothic depiction of, nuclear anything that you might imagine. It's got human hair and it's got green bile seeping. And he describes, let me go here. There were patches of hair growing on the deer's antler. The deer was deformed. The hide was torn and bleeding in places, and green bile seeped from the holes and that the bullets had made. The hair on the antlers looked like mangy human hair, and the eyes were two white stones mottled with blood. The buck was blind. Its legs were bent and gnarled. That's why it didn't bound away. The tail was long like a donkey tail. And so part of the question here is, why did he decide to make this deer so monstrous? I want to cut to a little quote by a former student. I worked a little bit with her on this project. She is from Santa Clara Pueblo, and she did her senior thesis at Santa Fe Indian School on the aftermath of the Manhattan Project on Los Alamos. And I want to show this quote really fast.
There was a saying that came from traditional prophecies, Owe returning Noa dihet bohema, in translation being, one of these days they're gonna get sick too, meaning the Los Alamos people. Because as time went on and our people got sick, it was very much believed at that time a dead Indian was a good Indian and they couldn't care less.
So, in Angelique's work and in other people's work, we have talked a lot about the effects on humans and human bodies, but also bodies of water, bodies of land. I think devil deer is one of the first times that we see in literature on the written page the discussion of the effects of the contamination on animal bodies, right? And again, even though this is a fabulation and it is sort of like the extreme thinking of anything nuclear, it is commentary on the effects of the local bodies and the local landscape. Oops. So just to sort of start to end and wrap this up, um, I have been thinking a lot about where nuclear work and nuclear workers and sort of the impact that it's had in our culture, or one of the ways that we talk about culture in New Mexico is thinking about this idea of querencia. Querencia is this concept of a place where one feels safe, a place from which one's strength of character is drawn, where one feels at home. And it's often said that even the bull in the bull ring prefers a certain place within the plaza where he fixates his gaze, into which he will retreat once he is wounded to rest and feel safe. Said in another way, we sometimes describe it as that idea of, it like the back of your hands, right? You've heard that phrase before. And so our querencia is this love and respect for our home and our homeland, because that is where we feel safe and that is where we draw our strength, not just strength, but strength of character, which comes from our culture. And I'm really questioning the effect of the labs on our querencia, right? On our culture, on our safety. It's this question of whether or not we've become desaquerenciados, or sort of the opposite of querencia, but now we're afraid of hunting, we're afraid of engaging in these cultural practices. We're desensitized to making nuclear weapons, we're desensitized to threats of nuclear war, right? And ultimately, it's, why would Anaya feel write so much about nuclear topics? Bombs and terrorists and monsters, how do they relate to this place, to this New Mexico that Anaya loved so much? people write about Anaya as a person obsessed with New Mexican culture, a person obsessed with Hispanic culture. And really, he was also equally obsessed with nuclear culture and thinking about what nuclear culture says about our querencia and about our culture. So this is sort of where I'm at right now in the project. With the help of a graduate student, Bilge Aydin, we have been uh, scrolling, trolling, going through the entire Rudolfo Naya archive, which happens and luckily happens to be here at the University of New Mexico, for about, I don't know, 8 months now. We have pulled so many references, and while I'm not ready to start divulging everything that we've either found or that connects to this project, I will say that there is a lot that is there to support some of these claims that I'm making, that we're making. This letter here on the left is from his agent, Susan Bergholtz, who is a very famous literary agent. She was also Sandra Cisneros' literary agent, if anybody's familiar with her, who's like one of the most well-known Chicana authors. And this was sort of commentary on what was happening after she first read Hemispring and her questions that she had about the cultural aspects of that. This newspaper article that we found in his archive is interesting because it has this is this continuation of an article about local people, Pueblo people, questioning what Los Alamos should do with its nuclear waste on the same page that the Bless Me Ultima film was being announced. So we see those connections. Here on the left, we see a comic about Zia Summer. And I'll just read this. Rudolfo Naya published Bless Me Ultima in 1972, which is considered the classic Chicano novel. He's had previous publications of essays, children's stories, folk tales, drama, and literary criticism. His latest mystery novel, Zia Summer, is a radical departure from his previous publications. He enjoys writing about the city and depicting aspects of Hispanic culture in his stories. And then it says, right on, Rudolfo. And I take issue with this. It's a radical departure because it's actually not a radical departure because, as this bigger study shows, he's writing about nuclear topics in almost all of his work. And then this is probably my favorite thing we've found so far. I have it here because it's a direct reference to Devil Deer. It was a newspaper article that was emailed to him in 2002. And this is Anaya's handwriting we've identified where he writes devil trees, question marks, Merry Christmas. We also took it as our Merry Christmas. We're finding the things that we wanted to find in the archive. So I'm gonna wrap it up there, but I would love to, there's so much more I could say. I've condensed this pretty as briefly as I possibly could for today. But I would love to have more conversation and maybe answer some questions. And I'd just like to acknowledge and thank Bilge, my doctoral student, who's been working with me on this, and also the staff, the archivist and the student staff at the Center for Southwest Research. Yesterday we were working in there, or Tuesday, I guess we were working in there together, and we had 3 boxes on the table, and I yelled across the room to the archivist, "We're breaking the rule of having 1 box at a time." And he goes, "Yeah, you probably are," and just kept working. So we've become kind of a fixture, especially Bilge in there. And then, of course, Mia, Liz, and the Hanford Challenge for inviting me today. So I'm going to stop there and hopefully there's some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Myrriah, for sharing your research and this different look at Rudolfo Anaya's work. I think if people want to put questions either in the chat or use the Q&A feature, that works too. We have a question related to plutonium pit production, asking if you could announce that there will be a public comment period later this year, and about plutonium pit production and transport to WIP and other opportunities for people to support by writing comments on these issues.
Yeah, so I'll say a quick thing about that. So, so I feel like sometimes I have my feet in 1 foot in both worlds, right? Doing sort of academic things and then trying to do work with the community. There's several organizations here in New Mexico right now that are working to get people to submit public comments to both the site-wide environmental impact statement. The final version was released, and comments on the final version will be accepted until the end of the month. And then because we've realized that people don't really know how to participate in that public input process, we are trying to encourage and teach people how to participate. We have the upcoming programmatic environmental impact statement that'll be drafted and released very soon. And then there'll be a comment period for that as well. The nuclear industrial complex, like I said, we're not in a post-colonial state anymore. We're not there yet. We'll probably never be there. Well, hopefully we will. But anyway, we're still very much in the colonial period of colonialism or neocolonialism. And in terms of thinking about the waste isolation pilot plant or pilot project, WIP in southern New Mexico, which is a transuranic waste permanent storage facility, permanent repository, there are proposals on the floor, so to speak, to expand WIP, even though it should have been shut down and closed off and permanently done. Uh, that should have already happened last year. And so there's public input being accepted on all of those. Joni, I don't know if you're on. I don't have the websites nearby, but if you could drop those into the chat, that would be great. If you want to learn more information about this process, you can also visit the Concerned Citizens for Nuclear Safety website, nuclearactive.org. Or Nuke Watch New Mexico also has a lot of good information. The other organization is Tewa Women United. Their website, you could find information about it as well.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. When you teach this class to students for the first time, what are their reactions to Anaya's work and to these connections with the nuclear industrial complex and the
Yeah,
bomb?
yeah, it's a good question. You know, part of the process is so with the Anaya class, it's not entirely focused on nuclear issues. The project that I have the students do, they work on it pretty much throughout the semester is an archival research project. So they go into the archives and they look for things that are interesting to them. But some students who take the class take it because they read Bless Me Ultima, which used to be, I found out recently, it's no longer a required text for New Mexico students, but at one point it was. And so a lot of students take it because they've read Bless Me Ultima. Some students take it not knowing who Rudolfo Anaya was, and so it's that buildup. But for me, that thread is always there, the nuclear thread. And so when they start to make those connections, it's often fun when students have taken my atomic bomb culture course, where I usually teach Hemispring, and then they take the Anaya course because then they realize it wasn't just in Hemispring, it's in like way more of his work. It's in his poetry, it's in his short stories, it's in his essays, it's in other novels. And they begin to make the connections for themselves without me having to force that on them. That Anaya, who was writing about New Mexican culture perpetually, has written nuclear issues into New Mexico culture, New Mexican culture, and making that, drawing that conclusion that he's basically saying that nuclear is part of our culture now. And then they start to ask the more complex questions. What does this say about querencia? What does this say about complacency? And then the semester ends and I send them off to figure these things out more on their own. Um, but um, but yeah, I mean, I think it just shows the power of literature. The other reason, and I don't think I even mentioned this, that it's important that it's Anaya writing about this is because he's an internationally known author. So when you have an internationally known author, Chicano author, who's sort of one of the authorities, at least, on both Chicano culture and New Mexico, and you see nuclear in there, it's introducing people who don't know anything about what's happening in New Mexico to these issues that are happening, the real, right, the facts that are happening here. So yeah, it's really fun to introduce students to nuclear issues through his work.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. Um, I think I'll read a comment that came in. Oh gosh. Thank you. Absolutely. You're on to something essential, and thank you for bringing literature into the discussion head on. What a vexed Carinthia that Anaya is exploring this because radioactivity permeates the beloved land, hard to live with consciously, i.e., not desensitized. Yet, how can the Carinthia actually be if it's with deadened desensitization, really looking forward to how you and your students explore and speak right about this conundrum.
Yeah, thank you, Norma, for that question. I'll give a little bit of a backstory about how I started questioning it within the same context of querencia specifically. And I write a lot about querencia. I wrote about querencia in like the conclusion, the last chapter of my book, questioning it. I have an article coming out this summer. It's actually about a new art exhibition that opens tonight at the National Hispanic Cultural Center called Nuclear Past, Present, and Future. Um, Asking that question, have we become desaquerenciados, right? Is this no longer a place that we feel at home and we feel safe because it's been because of all the nuclear presence here? But the reason I started making those connections, I had a student in my class a couple of years ago, a couple of semesters ago, who is from my community. She actually grew up like a stone throw away from my grandma and grandpa's house. And she's my student here at UNM, but she went to school in Los Alamos, so which is about 20 minutes away, about 15 miles away from where I live. And she was having a real, this was my atomic bomb culture class. She entered the class like having a really hard time, like, no, no, this is not true. These are not what's happening. And then later in the semester, we started having this conversation, and she said, but Los Alamos and all of this culture is very much a part of who I am and how it raised me. And what does that say? And I was already thinking about this, but she and I were able to talk about it. Like, what does it say about all of our community members and our family who work at the lab? You know, and then I started saying, well, when you have four generations of family members who've worked at the lab, Manhattan Project, their child, their child, their child. I mean, we've got like four or five generations deep now who've worked for quote unquote the lab. Um, is the lab a part of our querencia because of the economic security that these jobs provide? So I don't really have a clear answer yet, Norma, to that question. I think that it I think that that's part of the answer, is that it's not so much dead insensit or decent it's not so much desensitization all the way around. People are very aware that their livelihood and the way that they have some families gotten out of poverty is because of these quote unquote good jobs at the lab, right? And so they're very aware of that, which makes them hesitant to speak out against the lab or to question what's happening in the weapons production or the plutonium pit production. And I was taught by one of my Pueblo elders that we need to always be thinking about this in the sense of nuclear safety rather than, nuclear abolition. I don't know, that there's different times and places for these things, but when you pose it to community members as safety, like your safety is in question doing some of these jobs, right? Then it may cause them to be more concerned, less desensitized, and more involved in sort of like a site-wide environmental impact statement that talks about work, or a programmatic environmental impact statement. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about, that I'm thinking about right now. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but
Yeah, thank you. What is the percentage of local Chicano citizens that are concerned about nuclear risk? I don't know if you have that number.
percentage, I don't know. I'm hoping to get some grant money to start a huge project here out of UNM that would involve a lot of different researchers, a lot of my colleagues. And I was chatting with one of my colleagues a couple of months ago, who is a political scientist and is really good at doing surveys and doing sort of qualitative analysis. And they informed me that they were working on a project with another university. I'll just say another university. And they actually had started doing some preliminary surveying of New Mexicans. And they told me that the data, this early preliminary data that they had collected, actually showed that New Mexicans were against nuclear weapons production. And so these things get really complicated depending on who you're surveying, what part of the state you're surveying, right? If it's a community that is primarily benefiting off of these good jobs, right, or high-paying jobs, that data might be a little bit different. But while I don't have the number to answer that question, I will say that that's something that we're we're going to start pretty soon. I'm hoping that we can get the funding to do that, and then hopefully we'll be able to make that data accessible. It really just depends, I think, where you survey and who you talk to, and the types of questions you ask. Because when I start to talk about this as, well, we don't have to shut down the labs. They're technically scientific laboratories. If we think about the mission pivoting, people don't have to lose jobs, right? The other part of that I tell my students all the time is, I need you to be a nuclear engineer. I am not telling you don't do nuclear engineering. Somebody's got to figure out this waste problem, right, Hanford people? Like, we need nuclear engineers for that. So, yeah, I think it's a really complex question, and I think that, to my knowledge, nobody has full scale surveyed New Mexicans about that.
Mhm. Yeah. Thank you. We have a question. Is there any idea who Rodolfo Anaya may have consulted with for information on nuclear weapons back in the 1960s and 70s when he was writing the Bless Me Ultima?
When he was writing Bless Me Ultima, so okay, so there's two answers to this question. Bless Me Ultima, I don't know who he was consulting with. It's, he was born in 1937, so that made him 37, 38, 39, 45 years old when the bomb exploded, right? Um, which puts him about the same age as Antonio in the novel. He probably knew about it just from hearing conversations around him about the Trinity test, and beyond the scope of that actual quote, like it doesn't really appear anywhere else in Bless Me Ultima. Now,
Okay.
the other answer to that question is, who was he consulting for information on all these other texts? And that
Mhm.
is literally why we went to the archives, because I wanted to see what he was consulting. And
Mhm.
so, nothing really, like, we still have, I don't know, 20 some unprocessed boxes to go through. And so, I'm hoping that we find that. There's been a lot of newspaper articles, some correspondence. He was invited multiple times to speak at the labs for, like, Hispanic Heritage Month, to talk about novels. So I think that there's some things that overlapped there, but it's still not clear to me. And that's one of the reasons I went into the archive initially. That's actually like the very reason. And also I think there might be an unpublished manuscript in there about this, but we haven't found that yet either.
Thank you. Are there other regions in the US or the world that you think have nuclear literary cultures quite like New Mexico? Which ones have been useful for you in thinking about New Mexico in a comparative way?
Hmm. Yeah, so that's a really great question, and I'll try to keep my answer brief. So, when I talk about Anaya, Anaya is very heavily influenced. He identified as Indo-Hispano, or indigenous Hispanic, and he draws a lot of his work from both local indigenous cultures and Mexican indigenous cultures, which is a whole different conversation about how he does that. Then, of course, we have indigenous writers in New Mexico who write about it. You hear the quote from Angelique Abeta there, sort of thinking about indigenous epistemologies in the ways, we know authors like Leslie Marmon Silko, and Paula Gunn Allen, and Simon Ortiz from New Mexico. But also you do see it around the world. I think Australia has a pretty strong culture of thinking about this. And when I first started this work, one of the things that I was arguing, because I come from a literature background, is that because we are coming from oral traditions, we have to be thinking about oral storytelling, as a culture, as a literary tradition as well, right? So not everything is written down, so it's not always a written literary history. One of the books that I love to teach, in my atomic bomb culture class, is Terry Hines' Atomic Farm Girl, right? And I think that there are lots of different traditions. I think the South around not just Savannah River Site, but also Oak Ridge in Tennessee, like, you see African American cultural traditions talking about it. So I think there is a lot out there. I don't know if, comparatively with numbers, and I don't know if that's important. I think what's important is that, with Anaya's work, he's able to draw from, because we have such a vast nuclear fuel chain plus in New Mexico. He could be talking about uranium mining in one part, plutonium bombs in another novel, devil deer from contamination in another piece, nuclear waste, whip waste in another novel. There's a poem where he's talking. I mean, he's able to draw from so much, and there are not a lot of places in the world, much less in the country, that have that same nuclear history as New Mexico, and I think that's one of the most compelling parts about this.